Okay, this brief presentation is intended to introduce you to the concept of weighting factors, and this may be something that's already familiar to you. If so, this will be a good refresher, and we'll talk about specifics of how it gets applied in this class. If it's new to you, it's a way that you can use um, a process to help you make some informed decisions as we go through some of the case studies and the strategic decisions that we'll make. So we'll talk about the notion of decision criterion matrices, which are good ways to evaluate options. Oftentimes when we read through these case studies, there's a lot of information in there. Some of it seems kind of commonsensical, or we would like to make decisions based on our gut or intuition. And sometimes those are fine, but it's also helpful if you can back it up with some form of more subjective approach to making your decisions. And so what this weighting factor and this decision criteria matrix helps you do is to factor out some of the subjectivity and make a little bit more of a sound, rigorous decision based on the data and the information available. I encourage everybody to use caution when you do this to be sure you're using the right method and the right scale and the right weighting factors. With each of these cases, there are many options to consider. There are many criteria that you could use. And just to keep it simple, I'm asking you to use basically a 3 by 3. So what are 3 options you're considering, and what are at least 3 criteria that you're using to decide which option is best? And we'll go through a couple of examples here in a minute, and I'll show you more what I'm talking about. The more you know about a case and about the data and about the different details of a particular situation, the more refined you can get with your weighting factors and your scales. Sometimes you just know enough to say that one option is better than the other, and you can, say this is a higher option as opposed to the other one that's a lower option. Sometimes you can get a little bit more rigorous and say, on a scale of 1 to 5, this is a 4 and this other option is a 3. And maybe you can even get a little bit more detail and get it out of a scale of 10. But at first you may not know what the weighting factors are, or be able to do more than just kind of a 0, 1, 2. If you've got 3 options you're considering, what's the worst option, which would get a score of 0? What's the best option, what would get a score of 2? And then what's the one that falls in the middle, which would get you a score of 1? So a couple of examples here that we'll go through. And these first 2 approaches here, there are no weights given, meaning that each of the factors, the criteria factors that you're considering, are of equal weight. And there, again, we'll consider that there are 3 options that you're considering with the case. There'll be questions that are posed about each of the cases, and you'll be able to choose 3 different options that you would consider in terms of what you would do. And with each of them, there are going to be many different factors to consider. So in this particular case, let's just assume that for factor 1, whatever it is, option 1 and option 2 are basically the same. So they get and they're good, so that they get the highest rating of a 2. And option 3 is not as good, but it's not horrible, so it gets a rating of 1. So that's for factor 1. For factor 2, you know a little bit more information. So you know that option 2 is the worst, so you're going to get that a score of 0. You know that option 1 is a little bit better, that gets a score of 1. But of these 3 options to consider, option 3 is the best, so that gets a score of 2. And you continue this for the other factor, and if you add up the numbers, you realize that the total score here, you end up getting a 5 for option 1. So that would be, in this particular case, that would be your best option to consider. Yes, it's only 1 point better than the others, but in this very kind of crude model with no weight factors and just a scale of 0, 1, and 2, that turns out to be the best one. Now, over the next 3 examples that I'm going to show, I'm going to illustrate that even if you consider the same relative order of the ranking of the options, what's worst, what's best, and what falls in the middle, but if you add a weight factor, or if you increase the granularity of the scale, instead of from 0, 1 to 2 to 0 through 10, you're going to get different results. So in this particular case, same as we had above, where option 1 and option 2, remember, they both got a score of 2 up here at the top. So in this particular case, there's still option 1 and option 2 are still pretty highly ranked, but option 2 is a little bit better, so that gets a score of 10. And then option 1 is a little bit worse, that gets a score of 8, but they're still relatively high. And then option 3 is the worst of all. So as above, where it was the lowest ranking one, here it gets a rank of 6. And then similarly, as above, where we had option 2 was the lowest ranking, it's still the lowest ranking, but maybe we know a little bit of information, we can give it a 2. Option 1 has the middle ranking, so it gets a score of 5. And then option 3 has the highest ranking, so it gets a score of 7. Now this is just because we know a little bit more information. And when you do this, you realize that option 1 and option 2 end up with the same score, same overall score of a 21. So now it changes the picture a little bit, whereas above you would say, okay, well, let's choose option 1, that's the best one. Now we're saying, well, we're not sure. Option 1 and option 2 are very comparable, and even option 3 is still pretty close behind. It's only 2 points behind. So let's add in weighting factors and see what happens. So let's move to the next slide. And if you add in weighting factors, this is to show if you have three factors that you're considering, whether they be say quality and safety and customer satisfaction, whatever they might be. Let's say that one of them is much more highly rated than the other. So factor 2, for the reasons that you have enough information about the case to realize that factor 2 was the highest and most important one. So that gets 70% of the weight of all. Factor 3 is still important, but not nearly as high, so that gets a ranking of a 20% ranking. And then factor 1 is, you want to make sure it's included, but it's the lowest ranking, so that only gets a factor of 10. Now, if you look back at the rankings from the first approach that we had, the scores are the same. Remember, we had a ranking as a 2 for option 1, we had a ranking as a 2 for option 2, and we had a ranking as a 1 for option 3. But now if we apply the weighting factors, you multiply that score by the 10%, you get different numbers. Similarly, in the middle, we had, remember, the option 2 was the lowest ranking. It had a score of 0. So 0 times 70% is still 0. Option 1, we had a ranking of 1. So 1 times 70% is 0.7. And option 2, we had a ranking of 2. So 2 times 70% is 1.4. And you continue this on for factor 3, and suddenly now we realize that it's a pretty clear distinction here that option 3 is the best option to consider here. Much more significant than the other ones. And the reason for that is because of this 1.4 scoring here, because of this weighting factor of 70% was so high. So here you can see that if we have a weighting factor and there's a significant difference between how important one factor is to the others, but again, it can significantly change the final results. The same thing applies on the bottom on approach 4, but now we have a weighted scale. Instead of just 0 and 1, now we have more information, so we can be a little bit more confident and rank things from a scale of 0 to 10. So as we did in option 2 on the previous slide, approach 2 on the previous slide. This is still the highest ranking one, so it gets a 1. It gets a 10. This is the next highest ranking, so it gets a score of 8 times 10% gets 0.8. And over here we get a score of 6 times 10%, so we get 0.6. Same thing here, we had a score of 5, so we get 3.5. We had a score of 2, so that's 1.4 times the 70%. And over here we get a 4.9 as the final score, which is the highest ranking of all. And here again, if you add up the numbers, you get that option 3 is the highest option to consider of a 6.7. So the reason I go through these options here is to show a couple of things. If you don't have very much information and you can't apply weighting factors, if all of the factors are equally weighted, then you would use the simpler approaches on the first screen. If you're able to distinguish between the different factors and give one a higher weighting, higher priority than the others, then you can do that, and you might see some different results. Similarly with the scaling factors, if you just know the very basics, you use 0, 1 to 2. What's the worst? What's the best? What one falls in the middle? If you have more information, then you can use a scale of 0 to 10, get a little bit more refinement. So with that in mind, I encourage you to use these on your case studies as you do. Consider at least 3 options in terms of choices for the strategy and at least 3 factors to consider. You can use more, but just for the purposes of this class, we don't need to go crazy with a 50 by 50 matrix on this. But I want you to at least use a minimum of 3. So with that in mind, good luck on your assignments, and please post any questions or comments to the forum, and I will respond to them as soon as I can. Thank you.